Hi, everybody. I'm Tom Vander Ark, the CEO of Getting Smart. Welcome to this session. I hope it's the highlight of your Excel and Ed Summit. Today, we're going to be talking about COVID-19 and disruptive reconstruction, making the American dream real again and for all this time. I'm happy to be joined by two of my favorite people. Dr. Pamela Cantor is the founder and now senior scientist at Turnaround for Children. Turnaround is, I think of it as the most important multidisciplinary science insight engine that's bringing to life insights on learning and development. Dr. Cantor's background makes her really the foremost expert in trauma-informed care. But the Turnaround team is full of scientists that have really gleaned insights from science to teach us about how children and youth develop and grow. We're going to talk about that today with Dr. Cantor. And Jim Shelton. Jim is a multi-sector operator and investor, former Deputy Secretary of Education in the Obama administration. My favorite thing about Dr. Cantor and Jim Shelton are that at various points in my life, they have been the most influential and productive thought partners that I've ever worked with. And it's just a thrill to have them both together here to talk about what's happening in the world and how we can create a path forward. So Jim and Pam, welcome.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Tom.
I'd like to start, Dr. Cantor, by just inviting you to reflect on what the heck is happening. It strikes many of us that this now almost year-long pandemic has in many ways laid bare many inequities that existed in society, but it's just made them, it's brought them out in plain sight for many to see. How do you see that?
You know, I think we all see examples every day that the forces now shaping our children's futures before the pandemic have been dramatically amplified because of the inequities of life experiences, the inequities of hardship that many children and their families are experiencing now. These forces cry out for an examination of the specific factors that could accelerate opportunity and growth coming out of a time like this. The thing is that we have the knowledge today to not only recover from this crisis, and we shouldn't be satisfied with recovery. We have an opportunity right now to imagine a very different kind of multidimensional learning system that does something that our 20th century system was never designed to do. Because that system wasn't designed to develop the learner, it wasn't designed for equity, and it wasn't designed to unlock the creativity and potential in each and every young person, no matter where their lives begin. So you use the phrase inequities laid bare. What that means to me is that no matter which part of the achievement spectrum you look at, we are seeing a challenge for all students and a compounding of inequities that are hitting Black and Brown students the hardest. Kids who have been living in low-income communities have been attending schools where their performance and definition of success was based on how well they do on an annual ELA and math test. Can you imagine if that was the sole definition of success for you? These students, who are primarily students of color, have been historically underdeveloped and undereducated by our current system. And today they are attending schools that were not prepared for high quality distance learning and did not have the tools and infrastructure to do it well. And they're living in homes where many parents don't have the privilege of working from home or of supporting this kind of learning for their kids, even though they'd want to. And kids at the upper end of the income spectrum attend schools that have supported them their entire lives in the building of a robust set of skills, not just English and math, including opportunities for creativity and learning things like perseverance and resilience, analytic and problem-solving skills, skills that prepare them for life and for future opportunities. Even with this, when you look at the US globally, our academic performance on all the major indicators is declining by comparison to other developed countries. No matter where you look, there's a clear call to action for a redesign of our learning system toward a system with a new purpose and goal, one that is focused on developing and preparing each and every young person with the 21st century skills and mastery level competencies that prioritize how to use and apply knowledge, no matter what their starting point in life. And today, particularly because of COVID, we know that those starting points are going to be more variable than ever before.
Jim, do you see an opportunity in this disruption that's so painfully has and disproportionately has attacked women and people of color? Is there an opportunity to address some of the longstanding disparities that Pam talked about?
I think that what Pam pointed out is not only directly on point, but does reveal not only the opportunity, but the definitive need that we have. I think it's important for us to just recognize the context on which COVID was laid, right? People are very focused on the crisis of the moment, but the reality is this has been a crisis that's been building before our eyes without full recognition. Raj Chetty, as everybody now pretty well knows, said it was pretty clear in the 1940s that 90% of Americans could count on having the American dream, doing better than their parents did economically. And by the time someone was born in the 80s, it was down to a 50-50 shot. That's not for African Americans or Latinos, that's for all Americans. Works off for African Americans and Latinos. And that underpinning of inequity and lack of mobility is what has been exacerbated, as Dr. Cantor described. What I think that the opportunity for us to do is to recognize that, as Pam said, we have the science now to recognize three really important things that our schools have not really paid attention to. And it's been most pronounced because for low-income children, their families aren't able to make up the ground, right? For higher income schools, I'm not sure actually that they've done that much better in many cases. It's just that their parents were filling in all the gaps. And so now what we know is that there is both the experiences that young people need that require that they get the kinds of exposure that are fully engaging, and that has to happen in this context online where frankly there's just been no access. The second is that the environment itself needs to be entirely different as well. And then the third is that the relationships that you need to actually make all of that come together for someone where they feel connected, they feel supported, and it can actually overcome many of the challenges that students face in and outside of school. Those need to be a priority in the school settings as well. When our young people come back, they're not just going to need to learn their ABCs. They're going to need the full suite of resources that are required, not only for kids who've suffered trauma, but for the trauma of coming back into a school where education has been completely disrupted, for struggling for the first time, for being behind, for realizing that you actually don't understand the things that you were used to understand even before you left. So we're going to all have to organize ourselves to do something very different.
One thing I appreciate about both of you is you've spent the last 20 years trying to bring to light the lessons of science. You've both mentioned that we know more today than we did 20 years ago. I'd love to have you both try to summarize what we know today about the science of learning and development. And Dr. Cantor, let me start with you. How would you summarize what we know today about how children learn and develop?
Before COVID-19, Tom, and the events of the past year, if I had had an opportunity to talk to you about human development, the development of the brain, and learning science, I would have begun with this. Each of us has about 20,000 genes in our human genome. Yet in our lifetime, fewer than 10% of these genes will ever be expressed. What do you think determines what's in that 10%? It's context. It's the environments, experiences, and relationships in our lives, just as Jim just said. The context that we are exposed to is the primary driver of who we become, including the expression of our genes. So the risks and the opportunities in development and learning sit inside this one profoundly important point, that there is no separation between nature and nurture, biology and environment, brain and behavior, only a collaboration between them. And this means our lives are not predetermined by a genetic program. Genes are chemical followers. They're little packages of protein covered with receptors that are triggered into expression by the environments, experiences, and relationships in our lives. So if nurture drives nature, there is both good news and bad. It means that our brains are a living structure made up of tissue that is the most susceptible to change from experience of any tissue in the human body.
Dr. Cantor, it sounds like we could think about the 21st century skills that are often described not as a set of skills in absence, but really part of this developmental continuum of malleability that you're describing. Is that right?
Not only is that right, we had a period at Turnaround when we were very fortunate to have the leadership of Brooke Stafford Brizard. And we asked the question, how does any young person develop into an engaged, productive learner? Could there be pathways for this? Because if there were, we could intentionally build these skills in any student and in all kinds of learning settings. The framework that resulted is called the building blocks for learning. It's derived from a big body of learning science literature that shows a progression, beginning with the foundational skills you see at the bottom, like self-regulation and executive function. This is your cue, Tom. All the way up to those higher order skills at the top that we want all young people to have, like self-direction and curiosity, resilience and perseverance. And here's the good news. These skills are malleable, which means they can be built, and all of them are correlated with achievement. So this framework means that we can intentionally develop these essential skills in any young person, independent of their start in life. And even if you didn't get them early, you can develop them later, because the development of skills is a continuum. We all know this from our own lives. It's never too late to build these skills. And the idea that you can build these skills moves us away from this idea of, oh, he's talented, oh, she's smart, to the understanding that these skills that are so valued in life today, including and especially by employers, can be cultivated in young people so that their imagination, their creativity, and curiosity can be unlocked. But we do have to be intentional about this and design the settings and opportunities to build them.
I love that progression, because it's a reminder that agency and curiosity really start with a sense of belonging, with relationships, with making sure that basic needs are met, that we're helping young people learn to regulate their emotions. Jim, you know that building block progression well. Do you see those skills line up with what's necessary to get a job or make a job, what the employers are looking for, and the skills needed for entrepreneurship?
Sure. I think that if you take a look at that list, it's pretty apparent that that many of those skills are the same, with different labels, the same kinds of things that we're looking for in most employment opportunities, in most leadership roles, and frankly, definitely in the creative economy that we have to have going forward if we want to be competitive as a nation. I think another thing that's really interesting about it is that what we're finding is, when I think about myself or I think about others, I'm always encouraged and optimistic hearing Pam talk, because I know that some of those boxes were not quite filled out right.
It's not too late.
Not too late.
Even for old people like me, right? I appreciate that.
You and I both. The second thing, though, is really important, is just keep remembering that they are interdependent, right? That they feed each other up and down the stack. even though it's shaped like a pyramid. And similarly, when now we're thinking about schools and or work environments, we recognize that there's the full range of things that we have to be attentive to when we're thinking about what folks need. So after Brooke finished the work with Pam at Turnaround for Children, she went on to do a body of work to help us say, okay, if we really believe there's a broader definition of success for young people, what does it need to include, right? And it was, well, of course it needs to include their academic development, and of course it needs to include their cognitive development. But it also does include the social emotional dimensions. It includes their foundational mental and physical health. And then interestingly, it also includes their identity. It includes things like, what do you see? How do you see yourself, both as an individual and what group you belong to? And I keep wanting to press the research on this one, because fundamentally the first question is like, what do you believe you can do is often the regulating factor for what you can do. So the more we come to understand these things, both about how they're applied in school, how we create those environments and the kinds of relationships that support them, those same things are going to translate into the workplace in the different contexts for adults.
Dr. Cantor, stress seems to be the watchword of the day. I talk to a lot of teachers and principals, and they are just super stressed out. And the parents and children that I talk to appear to be under enormous stress by the bizarre conditions that we find ourselves. What does the science of learning and development tell us about how children react to these settings?
Tom, when trust and safety are broken, our bodies and minds are seized by stress. So we have to talk about the biology of stress and what it does to us. And in particular, what it does to the structures of the limbic system, which is the learning and emotion center of the brain. We know that stress is the most common naturally occurring example of negative context. And when we experience stress, cortisol is released through our brains and our bodies, and it produces that familiar feeling of fight, flight, and freeze. It's intense when it happens, but if the stress is mild or tolerable, it's adaptive. It makes us alert and sharp, and it helps us prepare for an event or a test or a performance. This is our limbic system at work: attention, concentration, focus, memory, preparation. But when children have persistently high levels of stress, and that stress is not buffered by the presence of a trusted and calm adult, something else can happen. Children can get locked in that fight or flight feeling where it just won't let up. And this is the condition we call toxic stress. Cortisol can do a lot of harm to the structures of the limbic system, because today we know that adversity doesn't just happen to children, it happens inside their brains and bodies through the biologic mechanism of stress. But fortunately, that's not the end of the story. There's a big upside when we turn to another hormone, the hormone oxytocin. This is the hormonal system that produces feelings of trust and love, attachment and safety. And that's not all. Oxytocin hits the same structures in the brain as cortisol, yet oxytocin is the more powerful hormone because it can literally protect children at the level of the cell from the damaging effects of cortisol. So relationships that are strong and positive can cause the release of oxytocin. And this not only helps children manage stress, it offsets the damaging effects of cortisol, and it can even produce resilience to future stress. In fact, the human relationship and oxytocin are the most powerful example we have of positive context. So there are really only three things that you need to remember about brain development: the astounding malleability of the human brain, experience-dependent growth, and the role of context. And because of this, there's no such thing as a developing child independent of context. And it is this single point that carries the enormous opportunity we have, because we can use the principles of whole child design to build environments in our classrooms, our schools, and our homes that enable children to cope with stress and build resilience, environments that ignite learning and develop those 21st century skills and mastery level competencies that we've been talking about.
Jim, the climate crisis, the health crisis, and the resulting economic crisis are disproportionately impacting people of color. So it seems that to take advantage of what Dr. Cantor's described about stress, we need to start by recognizing the issue of race. How do we begin to do that?
I'll once again try and take us to say we do have the current circumstances. The reality is that this history of race and racial inequality, and frankly, the traumatic stress of race in this country has been building, in fact, compounding for generations. We are in many ways much better off than we've ever been as a nation. And in many ways, the stark contrasts that we see make the day-to-day stress of the environment in which we're living even more toxic in some ways.
Right.
And so what we have to recognize is that there's a compounding effect of all of the normal stressors in communities of color and low-income communities nationally. And while I want to talk about the race, what I want to emphasize for folks is the reality is that people of color, but especially African Americans, are largely canaries in the mine for everyone else. So what is happening right now, what's been happening for the last few decades, is white lifespans have been shortening. And they've been shortening in large part because of what are called deaths of despair. And if you follow those deaths of despair, they go to the communities where there's a lack of opportunity. So what we're finding out is that the behaviors that lead to deaths of despair are tied to communities that have a lack of opportunity. And many of those behaviors that we would have attributed to cultural inadequacies previously, we see are actually about what happens to people when they don't have the context, when they don't have opportunity, when they don't have the things they need to thrive. So why do I say all that? I say all of that because I think we need to deal with and reckon with race, not just because we actually need to allow people of color to get the full benefit of the kinds of environments and kinds of supports and kinds of loving relationships that Dr. Cantor described, but because if we don't, we will all suffer the consequences as a nation. The same kinds of environments that are going to allow people of color to thrive in this context are the same ones that are going to be required to keep the increasing pressure for white families that are for the first time experiencing the same kinds of lack of opportunity that many communities of color face in larger numbers. That is going to wind up being something that we're all going to have to reckon with if we don't figure out how to solve the problem now.
Thank you, Jim. You are both experts in designing learning environments and experiences that work well for all children. I'd love to have you both describe the sort of environments and experiences that are highly productive. Dr. Cantor, I'll start with you. You've had the opportunity over the last 2 years to work with the Science of Learning and Development Alliance to really build out a set of principles for effective learning environments. Maybe you could describe what we know about designing effective learning environments.
Absolutely, Tom. You know, it is worth mentioning, because my co-panelist is Jim, that when Jim was leading CZI created the opportunity that gave rise to the Alliance and gave rise to a massive synthesis of developmental and learning science literature that actually became a roadmap. And what the Science of Learning and Development calls for is for us to design schools and learning settings mapped to the way children learn and to the way the brain grows, because learning is a dynamic experience. So we need to design settings that actually combine a number of different elements, and we've talked about some of them already. Relationships, right at the top. Developmental relationships. Remember oxytocin, igniting learning, managing and mitigating stress. Environments filled with safety and belonging. We know that when children can see their culture and their histories represented, they learn best and they feel that it is safe to take risks on behalf of learning. rich, engaging learning experiences, and the development, the intentional development of that full set of 21st century skills for success, and the mindsets and habits that all successful learners have, and integrated systems of support. So it's these 5 elements that are critical to combine, because the development of a whole child emerges when we combine these elements into experiences that connect to one another. Picture a shape like a web of experiences, because that's how our brains actually grow. Lots of connections between brain structures, and it is these connections that produce increasingly complex skills, whether it's reading, solving a complex mathematics problem, riding a bike, or building resilience. And like we said, development is a continuum, and the development of a whole child actually begins before birth, continues into early childhood, and all the way into young adulthood, which means that development and learning are happening all the time and everywhere, at home, in community settings, and at schools. So imagine if all of these settings were rich in relationships and designed to optimize skill development, learning, and growth.
Jim, I feel like you've had an appreciation for these design elements for 20 years, since you were at New School Venture Fund and then the Gates Foundation. Would you agree with that you've been investing around those principles for 20 years? Or are there new insights that you'd want to add to what Pam has said?
So one, I would say, it is the power of having science to back up what I think many great educators over the years have intuited and have tried to reflect in their work, whether it be Jim Comer or PJ. I think is extraordinary. I think what is now incumbent upon us is to recognize that we have in many ways invested around these things, right? My first schools were called Learn Now Community Academies. People have had community schools of a variety of different kinds. People have talked about integrated services. People have talked about curriculum and rich experiences and rigor and relationships. Lots of different elements of these things have been talked about. What Pam is describing, though, is that we now have the ability to systemically and rigorously apply these principles in a very coherent way, in an integrated way, so that every child and each child gets exactly what they need. And we can do it at scale, and we frankly have to do it at scale. So I've been very fortunate to be involved with individual schools and networks of schools that made attempts at doing this work. And what we now have the opportunity to do at every single level of the system is to make it the norm that we are designing schools this way, and that we support them to actually be able to execute against this vision. And then lastly, that we recognize that we still have a lot of work to do to figure out what it means to do all this work well. So we should do it with an underpinning of R&D that allows us to continue this work and accelerate it over time.
Thank you, Jim. I'd like to have both of you comment on the future of measurement. It feels like while we've had this basic appreciation for the core elements of sound school design, it feels like we're in the very early days of the future of measurement, when we can really learn much more about the child in front of us than the very crude measures that we have been using, particularly for the last 30 years in America. Dr. Cantor, what can you tell us about the future of measurement?
Well, we've been talking about the idea that whole child design is about supporting the growth of individual young people, and that we know that schools can't do it alone. So kids are learning in settings that are not only schools. So we know we have to be able to see growth, and to do that, we need to demonstrate it, we need to measure it, not through averages. We need to be able to see the growth of individual young people, and not just in English and math. The full set of academic competencies, the building block skills for success in learning, work, and life that we've been talking about. So let yourself imagine a world where every child's life, was a succession of these kinds of opportunities in which they come to know who they are, what they're capable of, and they answer that question that Jim referred to: what can I become? Imagine that each child lived in a world that removed the constraints of racism, disparities, and poverty, and provided the experiences and relationships to support learning and thriving. And what if these kinds of opportunities were available to all kids, and no matter where any child began? So we would need to reject the mistaken belief that a few scores on group norm tests of aptitude and achievement represent a good assessment of a young person's potential. We need to reject the reliance on standardized measurement because it's based on a bell curve. And today we know that talent and skill are everywhere. They are not distributed in a bell curve. Instead, we want to measure and understand individual growth, person-specific growth, what nurtures it, what hinders it. And today, children are living in a world that's been unimaginably changed by COVID, a Maslowian world where their basic needs are not being met for shelter, food, safety, any child's basic needs. And since we know that context drives development, it is as important to measure context as it is to measure individual skills and competencies. In other words, we have to measure the fish and the lake, understand the relationship between the two, understand the fact that the fish is affected by the lake and the lake by the fish. That change will happen over time, and it won't be linear. There will be bursts and there will be plateaus. We know this from watching our own children, and that has to be captured in measurement. And for practitioners, and even for the students themselves, we need to know what is working, for whom, in what context, and what is not. And we need to know why. There has never been a time where understanding the individual context that children are living in could be more important. Remember that most other systems of measurement today are personalized and they factor in context. Think about medicine or sports. When you go to the doctor and your blood is drawn or your blood pressure is taken, it's yours. It's an individual measurement of what's going on in your body. And it begs the question, why? What explains that number? It's not an average of people your age, and it's not an average of your family members. And think about sports. You always have to consider factors that affect performance, meaning that athletes perform differently at different times and in different contexts, and they need to know why to optimize their performance. They want to know the conditions that will increase their chances for success. So to do this for learning, here's where I think measurement needs to go. I think we need to measure the skills that matter most, and that's more than literacy and math. And we have to measure those hard to measure skills, success skills. We need to measure growth of competencies on a mastery continuum, not using ranked standardized proficiency. We need to measure well-being in ways that are authentic, individual and person-specific, and in different settings that give us actionable insights about what students are experiencing, what's working, and what is not, especially today. And we need to know that there is a lot of quality formative assessment data that is being collected right now. And perhaps most of all, in addition to learner variables, we need to measure context, including the presence of stereotype, bias, and other examples of racism and white supremacy. We need to make sure we can fully communicate a young person's capabilities with credentials, transcripts, projects, and other artifacts that help a learner tell their story. And with the mathematics we have today, we can aggregate up from formative assessments that already exist and see what kids have accomplished across the year.
Jim, there's lots of barriers to the future that Pam described. How would you build on what she said, or comment on some of the measurement challenges that she referred to?
I think that what Pam laid out is both a requirement of where we have to go, and it lays the endpoint of what ultimately is a journey that we have to take ourselves on. Let me start though just by reminding us of something that she said at the very beginning. I'm always conscious that we have all been programmed around our understanding of how intelligence works, right? But I just want to remind us of for those not familiar with Bloom's 2 sigma problem. And for those who don't know, Bloom was a researcher who asked the very simple question: if you gave every child the basics of a healthy environment, what could they do? How far could they go? And he used as his proxy for giving them a healthy environment and figuring out where they could go, giving every single student a one-to-one tutor. And when he compared that to a traditional classroom, what he found is that the students with the one-to-one tutor actually performed 2 standard deviations better than the average student in the class. Now, what that means is that a 50th percentile student would be performing in the 90th percentile student, 90th percentile. Now, why is that important? Because like once you do that, and then once you buy that, then you know, as Pam said, it is not about the kids. It's about the experiences and the environments that we give them. I shouldn't have to teach you that more than one time. Now, the fact that we consistently fail to produce the experience and environments and relationships that do that is our fault, not theirs. So let's start there, because I just want to make sure we're clear about how flawed that set of assumptions are. So then, to Pam's point, as we've had this conversation, what we said is there is a much broader definition of both what human development looks like and what success looks like in terms of what a fully developed human looks like. There are parts of that we have very little experience trying to measure. We have almost no idea how to measure anyone's sense of identity. We're just getting there. We're just starting to get our understanding of how to measure things around executive function and things around their social emotional development. So there's a research agenda that needs to be built around each one of those dimensions, and not only individually, but how they actually, again, as I said, they're interdependent, how they interplay. And then what I'll say is there's an apparatus that needs to be built for very highly instrumented environments where you can actually measure those things, and we can measure them over long periods of time, so we can begin to understand when you don't have a really highly instrumented environment, what are we actually seeing about what's happening with an individual student and how it might relate to the context that they're in, right? Pam said it right. The holy grail question is what works for whom in what context. We don't have the tools to do that, but we can actually lay out and instrument an agenda that gets us to that point. And I think within a decade, we can be well along the way, though we need to recognize this is a generational challenge.
I appreciate that. Pam, or Pat asked a question in chat about measurement tools for measuring some of these hard to measure topics. So I appreciate this challenge. I think what both of you have referred to is that some of the hard to measure issues, executive function as an example, is something that we can measure in many different ways, in many different contexts. Pam, you have some experience as part of the Soul Alliance of seeing instruments that actually are quite useful. Maybe you could describe a couple of these new assessment tools.
Yeah, the work that we're doing as a part of SOLD is aimed at what we think of as our North Star, and that is the ability to look at the individual growth of these skills in an individual student. And we started with relationship skills, executive function, and self-regulation. The thing that's important to know is that measuring these skills is less about the measurement construct that you use than the methodology that you use. So if you do frequent measurement of executive function in a population of kids in a class, and you use the methodologies, the mathematics that are available today, you can see the development of executive function skills in every individual child in that classroom. And what we're seeking to do in this project is to actually identify pathways up through the building blocks that you saw before, through which you go from foundational skills like executive function at the bottom. But what we really are after is what are the patterns of skills and the layer of skill development that gets you to those higher order skills at the top. So right now, there are 3 skills that we've measured in this project. The plan is to measure most of the building block skills, but to actually use the methodologies to do, for instance, what we've done with reading and say, okay, which are the most common pathways that get you to self-direction, that get you to curiosity? Because if we knew what the pathways were, then we would actually use that to serve a design purpose so that we can intentionally build these skills in more kids.
I appreciate that. And I just want to note that both of you have talked about we've seen a step function increase in the amount of formative assessment that we have about young people, particularly during COVID, when everyone has gone virtual and everybody is spending time in adaptive learning systems. There's so much information trapped in those systems that if we build common definitions, some common data extract standards, that we can pretty quickly build comprehensive learner profiles that unlock a lot more knowledge about kids than we think we have access to. As Jim said, this is a big and important research and development agenda. With that, I want to sprint. Yeah, go ahead, Pam.
One of the other things I wanted to say about this is that, you know, I spoke a bit about the fish, I spoke about the lake, I spoke about this idea that there are many different measures that would give us that learner profile.
Right.
But what we do need is an instrument that is able, and what we're learning is that gaming technology, believe it or not, may be a way to integrate this formative data that is being collected in many, many different settings that give us a much fuller picture about student growth academically, but also in these essential skills and information about the context that is driving that growth.
And I'll just add that Jim knows well, having worked with thousands of great schools networks and districts, that good schools know how kids are doing every day in every important aspect. We don't take advantage of the fact that good schools know a lot about their kids, and the standardized tests that we use pretend that we don't know anything about them. So it feels like there's an invention opportunity here to make better use of the formative data that we have. So I appreciate that both of you have talked about that. Jim, I want to start to close out by talking about some policy recommendations, but maybe at the outset you could just talk about the role of government, because we've talked broadly today about the way children and youth develop, and we've talked about both education and what we've traditionally thought is youth and family services. So at the high level, how do you think about the role of government in this broad topic of the science of learning and development?
Sure. So I'll talk about a handful of things that I think are really important. Number one, government has set up the context where it provides the resources and then thus can also then determine what the rewards and consequences are for certain kinds of behaviors. And in particular, accountability systems drive that work. And so accountability systems that are more flexible, but also recognize that they are designed to encourage this much more holistic definition of success, are going to be essential to providing both the transparency and the advocacy that's needed to ensure all students actually get what they need. But it has to be open, it has to be flexible, it has to have a much broader definition of success. The second thing that I want to emphasize is that, there were lots of people still today will damn No Child Left Behind. And I look back at that time and I go that the thing that I think was the biggest problem, forget about how you feel about the assessment regimen is what our hypothesis was about how you actually improved your scores every year. Now, yes, overly narrow assessment regimens drive certain behaviors, but if you thought that the right way to dramatically improve my outcomes for my students in my school was around attending to their holistic set of needs and having better relationships and creating experiences that were exciting and engaging, as opposed to doubling down on my reading time and doubling down on my math time, et cetera, you might wind up, and we most probably would wind up with a different set of outcomes. But the hypothesis that most people operated from wasn't this holistic approach, wasn't the idea of creating these environments. And so putting in people's hands the evidence that says, hey, there is a better way, and this is the way to actually attain the aspirations that you have for your kid, both narrow and broad, that is really critically important role of government. And the tools and resources to do that are there. The third is that what we've been clear about is that it is not just about the academic setting. It's not just about meeting the kids' needs in terms of teaching them the specific academic skills, that attending to their those basic needs. Are they physically safe? Are they physically healthy? Are they mentally healthy and safe? Attending to those things through the integration of social services to attend especially to the needs of kids who don't have resources or live in environments that are challenging, but it's critically important to achieving on the other sides of the developmental continuum. And the last piece that I'll talk about is the importance of investing in the research and development that we've been talking about. And that is most decidedly the role of government. For over a decade, I've kept pointing out that we spend roughly $80 billion in R&D for the defense, similarly in health. And you drop to well below $2 billion a year for education, most of which is around evaluation, not creation of new tools and solutions. It is very much time for the federal government in particular to invest in an apparatus of significant scale for advancing learning for K-12 and adult learning, including workforce, not just spending money on training, but real R&D. And that is distinctly a role of the government.
I appreciate that, Jim. Earlier today, I was describing the fact that in health and biotech, basic science leads quite directly to changes in practice and policies and in tools. And that's not the case in education. That basic science hasn't made a direct link to practice, to licensure, or in ed tech. So there's a big opportunity in R&D to increase the amount of spending and to build the direct connections to practice, to licensure, and to new tool development. So
I say
let's add. Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, I say it less politely, which is because our kids don't have lobbyists to advocate for the R&D dollars to their next round of products, we need to do it on their behalf.
Yeah, well said. So we've jumped into the last section, which is I'd love to get a couple of policy recommendations. These can be both state and federal. It sounds like all three of us would put increased R&D spending. Pam, what else is on your list?
Well, big on my list is relief. We need a thoughtful relief bill at the federal level, or more relief coming from the federal level that acknowledges the level of crisis that has impacted the economic stability, the learning, the health, the mental health of such a large number of kids and families. The bill has to target support to the people that need it the most. And one of those groups, for sure, is working women, and the other are people of color who have been disproportionately impacted in terms of health, education, and employment. We need supports that take a scientifically sound, non-stigmatizing, trauma and culturally sensitive approach. That's a tall order to the multiple adversities and hardships that kids and families in low-income communities have experienced. We need tiered supports so that there is a differentiation such that students get what they need based on what they need as individuals. We have to view trauma now as widespread, likely leaving no one untouched, because of the losses from the illness and the uncertainty that it has caused to so many families. Trauma is a disruption to health, mood, skill development, behavior, learning, and trust. It can happen to any of us. Many people feel that trauma is somehow specific to the event that caused it. It's not. It's actually a specific pattern that we can recognize because we understand stress and its effects on the brain and the body. So there will be a pattern to the effects of trauma, and we can respond to that.
Jim, many of the recommendations that you've been talking about sound like they would take a different funding system than we have in America today. One in most states that sends more money to kids that live in affluent neighborhoods than those that live in under-resourced neighborhoods. Do we need a new funding system in America?
I think we may need a new funding system in America, but I think we underestimate what we can do with the system that we have today. I think that the very first thing that's really important to recognize is if you take in sum total everything that Pam and I have talked about today, what we described is makes plain that we never actually knew what it cost to run a system where you got it right the first time every time. If you attended to those broad needs, we spend an incredible percentage of the dollars that we spend in our school system redoing where we have failed students and their families. And if we actually do a better job of serving them at every step along the way, it's not clear to me that we can actually do all the things that we're talking about and deploy resources that we're already deploying in communities for social services in ways that are fragmented and have little impact, in ways that are much more aligned, much more integrated, much more impactful, and produce the outcomes that we're actually looking for. That said, we do actually need to recognize the most important point that Pam mentioned, which is context matters. And if you have young people who are operating in contexts where the very environments that they're in are not providing the kind of supports and services that they need, then by definition, even if you are developing them equal, they are trying to jump out of a hole. And so you have to fill the hole first so that they can actually have a shot at competing on a level playing field. I'm really disturbed by people keep talking about a level playing field as if people aren't trying to fight their way out of the hole first.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
The last is that there are certain things that we have now are very clear that we have just ignored over and over again. So the thing that is most salient right now because of COVID is the lack of investment in equitable access to technology. There's a good discussion on that at the conference earlier today even. And the reality is that I could go across a whole spectrum of tools and resources, but especially access to technology and learning opportunities that are going to be completely devastating. They're devastating now, and the gap between those who have it and those who don't have it over the next decade is going to explode if we don't immediately try to close it. So while I think there are big structural considerations to make when we come to thinking about the school finance system, I think there's some very practical things we can do with the system we have today that could dramatically improve outcomes.
Pam, what can you say about support for new and transformed settings for learning?
Well, I want to echo one big thing that Jim was talking about, because any of us who have either built a house from scratch or remodeled a house know which of those two situations is likely to cost more and use money less well because of the constant correcting of earlier problems. So when I think of what we could do today with the disruption at hand, I am thinking of the North Star that we've talked about, and it's an education and learning system transformed to develop all learners to their fullest potential with robust skills and competencies, no matter where they begin. And when I say that phrase, I'm talking about the whole that Jim just talked about. We can't act as if the hurdles are not there. The hurdles are there. And those are the things that have to be addressed if we want to see kids really, really move forward. So now we're living in a COVID world with massive inequities that have affected all kids and some kids way, way more than others. Yet, if you were to ask me the question, am I optimistic? I am optimistic. And one of the biggest things that keeps me optimistic is that what science, both the science of learning and the science of human development, tell us is a fundamentally optimistic story about what's possible when we design settings for growth, for development, for learning, with relationships at the center. So even in the face of this crisis, or maybe because of it, we know that we can't fall prey to false choices that we have made over and over again between core academic competencies and the acquisition of robust 21st century skills, and intentionally developing a student's social capital, the communities that Jim was talking about, the depths of despair. These are places where kids do not have social capital. They do not have adults that are creating pathways to opportunities for growth in school, but also out of school. So this is a time to support new education designs and models, whether in school or outside, because every school, every learning setting can be designed using whole child design principles that we've been talking about.
Jim, I'm worried that we're living through an education disaster with a couple million kids disconnected from school and probably 10 million kids with D's and F's heading for their end of semester report cards. Thoughts on how we address that, both short and long term, with new learning models?
Sure. So one, I'd start with exactly where Pam did, which is there needs to be a full recognition in any relief package that the break in the continuity of learning that has happened is unprecedented. There needs to be a deep investment in individual support for students and their families, but also in the kind of intervention and supports that's required to allow students to get back on track. We need to take the pressure off of kids trying to pass through the grade that they were in if they're not ready, and without permanently damaging the records for a context they had no control over. So I don't want to go down the path of what kind of grades kids ought to be getting this year, but it seems a little bit odd to me that that's a driving conversation right now. It's really important that we recognize that we've only got a few strategies that we know are highly effective at moving kids who are behind ahead very, very quickly. And that is very direct contact with caring adults who work with them in very small groups around structured content and experiences that are designed to help them accelerate. Tutoring, for lack of a better word, individual or small group intensive tutoring. We need to invest in that kind of work, especially for the students who have been left behind. And I think that there's a great opportunity in an environment where there's significant unemployment to put people to work for service for the country and a whole range of things, but this could probably be one of the highest. The second is that the kind of work that we need to do in terms of public works in the country to rebuild our infrastructure can also be lean into the kinds of new environments we need for our young people to learn in, and to make those pathways both inside and outside of school more accessible to more resources and community resources to do so. And I'll end on this last one, which is the connections that you, frankly, pioneered, Tom, in the early college high school work, connecting post-secondary to high school. We need to recognize that this is a perfect time to reattach those pathways so that young people don't have to actually lose time. They can actually regain that time if we're thoughtful about how we redesign the integration of the first 2 years of college and the 4 years of high school.
Dr. Pam Cantor and Jim Shelton, thanks for your contribution over the last hour and over the last 20 years. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you, Tom.